We're diving deep into a situation that just unfolded so fast. The U.S.-Mexico tariff standoff.
Yeah.
Just days ago, it seemed like a 25% tariff on all Mexican goods was inevitable.
Absolutely.
And then suddenly everything shifted.
Huge shift, yeah.
This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet, though, right? This impacts the relationship between two countries that are, deeply woven together.
Yeah.
And it even impacts you, the listener.
Absolutely.
Think about it, like the prices you pay, the goods you rely on, all of that was hanging in the balance.
Hanging by a thread, for sure.
We're talking last-minute calls between President's troops being deployed and even like a secret plan B that was kind of floating out there.
Right.
So let's untangle what really happened here and what it all means.
Yeah, the speed with which this thing escalated and then de-escalated, I mean, that's remarkable.
For sure.
The initial tariff threat, that was like an earthquake for both economies, and then boom, sudden resolution.
Okay.
This kind of high-wire diplomacy, especially with these two particular leaders, it's not something you see every day.
Exactly. And over the weekend, the tension was, almost palpable.
Oh, yeah.
And then, boom, tariffs are on pause after a phone call between President Sheinbaum and President Trump.
Right. The timeline itself tells the story. Yeah. A threat, a looming deadline, and then a resolution just at the 11th hour.
11th hour, for sure.
It underscores just how much pressure both sides were under and, how close we might have come to a real economic disaster.
Yeah, so let's break down this agreement itself.
Okay.
Mexico is deploying 10,000 National Guard troops to their border.
Yeah.
And this is specifically to combat drug trafficking with a focus on fentanyl.
And that focus on fentanyl is key for a couple of reasons.
Okay.
First, it's incredibly potent. Even small amounts can be deadly.
Yeah.
And it's been a major factor in the U.S. opioid crisis.
Right.
Second, politically, it allows Mexico to say, look, we're addressing your biggest concern.
Yeah, and on the U.S. side, there's a commitment to try and stem the flow of high-powered weapons into Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like a trade. Mexico tackles what the U.S. sees as their problem, and the U.S. promises to address what Mexico sees as their problem.
Right. It highlights that push and pull between these two nations.
For sure.
Mexico has long argued that the easy access to powerful weapons from the U.S. that fuels the violence of the cartels. And this agreement, at least on paper, acknowledges that.
Right.
Whether it leads to real change in U.S. policy, that's a different question.
That's the big question, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the big kicker, right? Tariffs are paused for 1 month while these high-level talks continue.
Right. Think of this as a ceasefire, not peace.
Okay.
It de-escalates the immediate threat, but it doesn't resolve the underlying issues.
Got it.
They've bought some time.
Right.
But the potential for conflict is still simmering under the surface.
Yeah, like just below.
Exactly. This whole situation really kind of underscores how intertwined the U.S. and Mexican economies are.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just about, tariffs and deficits.
Right.
It's about the millions of jobs, families, businesses on both sides of the border who really rely on this relationship to function.
Yeah, you're right. It's so easy to get lost in that macro view and forget that there are real people's lives at stake here.
Absolutely.
I mean, imagine like a Mexican farmer who depends on exporting their produce to the U.S.
Sure.
Or an American factory worker whose job relies on parts that are imported from Mexico.
Yeah.
I mean, their livelihoods are hanging in the balance of these decisions.
Absolutely. And those are just two examples out of millions.
Right.
I mean, the ripple effects of this tariff standoff would have been felt across every sector of both economies.
So zooming out a bit, what factors led to this near crisis? I mean, is this just about, President Trump's personality, or are there kind of deeper forces at play here?
Well, I think President Trump's, unpredictable and aggressive negotiating style definitely play a role.
Yeah.
His willingness to use tariffs as a weapon has created a lot of uncertainty in global trade. However, this situation's also a symptom of kind of larger shifts that are happening in the global economy.
Like what specifically?
Well, the rise of China as an economic powerhouse is a major factor.
Oh.
As China's influence grows, the U.S. is feeling the pressure, and that's leading to, a more protectionist stance. There's also a growing sentiment in the U.S. that trade deals, haven't really benefited American workers,
Right.
which fuels this desire to either renegotiate or abandon existing agreements.
So where does Mexico fit into all of this?
Well, Mexico's caught in the middle.
Yeah.
It's deeply integrated into the U.S. economy, through NAFTA and its successor.
Right.
But it's also facing its own internal challenges.
Like what?
Like drug cartel, violence, corruption, economic inequality.
Yeah, so both countries are facing immense pressure domestically and internationally.
Absolutely.
Which makes this situation incredibly volatile.
Exactly. And that volatility means that even small disagreements can quickly escalate into major crises like we almost saw here.
So let's talk about the potential scenarios now that negotiations are back on track.
Okay.
What could happen in the coming weeks?
Well, it's hard to predict with certainty,
Sure.
but there are a few possibilities. The best case scenario is that they reach a comprehensive agreement that addresses both countries' concerns,
Right.
maybe even leading to, a stronger modernized trade relationship.
That would be ideal. But is it realistic given the current climate?
It's possible, but both sides would have to make some serious concessions.
Like what?
The U.S. would need to relax its demands on immigration and border security, while Mexico would need to show a commitment to, cracking down on drug trafficking and invest in economic development that benefits all Mexicans.
Okay, so what about a less optimistic scenario? What happens if things go south?
Well, the negotiations could collapse,
Yeah.
leading to the reimposition of tariffs and, a breakdown of the relationship.
Right.
This would be a lose-lose scenario, harming both economies and potentially destabilizing the entire region.
That's a pretty grim prospect. It is.
Is there a middle ground we could see play out?
There's always a middle ground.
Okay.
We could see, a series of temporary agreements and extensions with both sides essentially kicking the can down the road.
Right.
While trying to avoid a full-blown trade war, it wouldn't solve the core problems. But it could buy some time and prevent a catastrophic rupture.
So a lot is still riding on these upcoming negotiations.
Absolutely.
And the stakes are incredibly high.
The outcome is uncertain, the pressure is on, and the clock is ticking.
Yeah, we've covered, the immediate crisis, the clashing narratives, the potential scenarios. But I keep coming back to this question of, what does this all mean for the average person?
Right.
How might this standoff and the outcome of these negotiations impact, our daily lives?
That's the critical question.
Yeah.
Because while this might seem like a high-level diplomatic drama,
Yeah.
The consequences will be felt very concretely in the lives of everyday people.
So let's break it down. What are some of the most direct impacts we might see? Well, I think the most immediate and obvious impact would be on prices.
Okay.
If tariffs are reimposed, the cost of goods imported from Mexico will increase.
Right.
This means you'll likely pay more for groceries, clothing, electronics, and countless other products.
Yeah.
Remember those avocados we mentioned earlier?
Mm-hmm.
They could become a luxury item rather than a staple.
Yeah, that's a noticeable hit to the wallet for sure.
For sure.
What about beyond just prices?
Well, job losses are a real possibility.
Okay.
Particularly in industries that rely heavily on cross-border trade. If companies face higher costs due to tariffs, they may be forced to cut jobs or even relocate operations to other countries.
Right.
And this could have a ripple effect throughout the economy, hurting businesses and communities on both sides of the border.
So we're talking about a potential hit to our wallets and a potential hit to our job security.
Yeah.
What else should we be paying attention to?
Well, I think the broader impacts on the overall health and stability of the U.S. and Mexican economies are important to consider. If this trade dispute escalates, it could damage investor confidence, discourage foreign investment, and slow economic growth.
Right.
And this would create a climate of uncertainty and potentially lead to a recession.
And let's not forget about the human cost of all this as well.
You're right. Increased economic hardship often leads to social unrest, political instability, and a decline in overall well-being.
Sure.
We can't lose sight of the fact that behind the numbers and the headlines,
Right.
there are real people whose lives are directly affected by these policy decisions.
So with these negotiations underway, what are some key things that we should be watching for?
Sure.
What are signs that things are heading in a positive direction? And what are the red flags that things might be going south?
Well, a positive sign would be a willingness from both sides to compromise and find common ground.
Okay.
If we see reports of concessions, less inflammatory language, and a genuine effort to understand each other's perspectives, that would be a good indication that progress is being made.
Okay, and what about the red flags? What should set off alarm bells?
Watch out for any escalation of rhetoric,
Okay.
threats of unilateral action, and an unwillingness to engage in good faith negotiations. If the focus shifts from finding solutions to assigning blame and scoring political points, that's a sign that things could be heading in the wrong direction.
So it sounds like this situation is still very much in flux, and we need to pay close attention to how things develop.
Absolutely.
What can we as individuals do to stay informed and engaged?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. Read news from reputable sources, follow developments closely, and seek out diverse perspectives.
Yeah.
Don't just rely on social media or sound bites.
Right.
Take the time to understand the complexities of the issue.
Yeah.
Go deeper than the headlines.
We've talked about the potential impacts on consumers and workers and the economy as a whole.
Right.
But it's crucial to remember that there's a human side to this story.
Yeah.
These aren't just economic forces that we're talking about.
Right.
These are real people whose lives are directly impacted by these decisions.
It's so easy to get lost in the talk of, tariffs and trade deficits, and forget that behind those numbers, there are individual stories.
Right.
Families that are trying to make ends, meet people who are worried about their futures.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are caught in the middle of this political tug of war.
Can you give us some concrete examples of what this human cost actually looks like?
Sure.
What stories have you come across in your research?
Well, one that really stuck with me was a Mexican farmer who grows avocados.
Okay.
And his livelihood, depends on exporting those avocados to the U.S.
Right.
And he was saying, if those tariffs were imposed, he wouldn't be able to compete.
Yeah.
He'd likely lose his farm, his income, his whole way of life.
Wow.
And his story isn't unique. There are countless others like him.
Right.
Factory workers, small business owners, families on both sides of the border.
Yeah.
They're all facing those same anxieties.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder that these aren't just, abstract policies. They have very real consequences.
Absolutely. We need to keep those human stories front and center as this situation unfolds.
Right.
The goal should be, solutions that benefit everyone,
Very
not
good,
just
yeah.
a select few.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways here?
Okay.
What have we learned, and what should we be watching for as this story continues?
Well, I think one major takeaway is just how complex and intertwined the U.S.-Mexico relationship really is.
Yeah.
It's not a simple win-lose scenario.
Right.
What impacts one country will inevitably have ripple effects on the other.
Yeah.
Both sides need to be aware of that interconnectedness.
So specifically regarding this standoff, what should we keep our eyes on?
Well, I think it's really important to watch the negotiations closely.
Okay.
Pay attention to the tone, the substance of the discussions. Are they willing to compromise? Are they addressing the root causes of the dispute or just the symptoms?
And looking beyond just these immediate negotiations, what are some of the broader trends to keep in mind?
This situation is kind of a microcosm of the rising tensions we're seeing in the global trading system as a whole.
Yeah.
As countries become more interdependent economically, these types of disputes are likely to become more common.
Right.
Finding ways to resolve them peacefully and constructively without resorting to protectionist measures that ultimately harm everyone,
Right.
that's going to be essential.
It sounds like we're in for a period of uncertainty and change on a global scale.
We are, but that also means that there's an opportunity to kind of reimagine how the global trading system works to make it more equitable, more sustainable.
Right.
It's a challenge, no doubt.
Yeah.
But it's one that we need to tackle head on if we want a more prosperous and just world for all.
This has been a truly insightful deep dive.
Wow.
With the immediate crisis to the broader context.
Right.
Exploring the economic, the political, and the human dimensions of this story.
Absolutely. And as the situation develops, we encourage everyone listening to stay informed,
Yeah.
participate in constructive dialogue, right, and advocate for policies that promote cooperation, fairness, and shared prosperity.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll continue to follow this story closely, and we'll bring you the latest.
Sounds good.
Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.